Listen carefully because this is not the kind of speech you just hear and forget. This is the kind that settles deep in your chest and stays there long after everything else has faded. There is a common misunderstanding about empaths that has been repeated so often that people started believing it without question. They assume empaths are fragile, overly soft, easily influenced, and simple to break. That assumption becomes their first mistake because what they fail to realize is that an empath is not weak at all. An empath is deeply aware. They observe energy in a way others barely understand. They can sense shifts in tone, meaning, and intention long before anything is said or done, and even then they still choose kindness. That is not weakness, that is control over reaction. But there is a moment that changes everything for them, a turning point where their entire way of seeing people shifts. When an empath is pushed beyond what they can repeatedly tolerate, they do not fall apart like others expect. They evolve. They grow into something sharper and more selective. Empaths naturally give more chances than most people would ever consider reasonable. They try to understand, they forgive more often than they should, and they look for the reason behind someone's behavior, even when they are the ones being hurt. But each betrayal adds weight. Every lie leaves an imprint. Every manipulation adjusts something within them, slowly building awareness until one day something inside them stops responding the same way. At that point, they stop over-explaining themselves. They stop chasing closure from people who never intended to give it. They stop pouring energy into situations that only drain them. And once that shift happens, it is not something they easily return from. The version of them that once tolerated confusion, disrespect, and emotional games is no longer the one in control. They become more grounded, more observant, and far more selective with their energy. People often think they changed, but in reality, they just stopped ignoring what they always saw. The difference is not blindness before and clarity now, it is awareness finally being trusted. The empath you once met was likely the softer version, the patient one, the one who gave room for mistakes and second chances. But the version that forms after repeated experiences is different. That version no longer gives blind trust. There are no more emotional exceptions for behavior that does not align with respect. There is no more sacrificing inner peace just to keep others comfortable. Instead, there is awareness of patterns, repeated behaviors, and hidden intentions that become impossible to ignore. Small shifts in tone are noticed immediately. Subtle disrespect is no longer brushed aside. What once required confusion now becomes instantly clear. Empathy was never the point of weakness people assumed it to be. It was always a deeper level of perception operating quietly in the background. While most people enter spaces focusing on how they are seen, empaths enter noticing how everything feels. They pick up on tension in the room without anyone speaking. They can feel emotional history in a person's presence without knowing the details. They detect emotional fractures in people long before those people ever admit them. Even micro changes in posture, breathing, and expression become readable signals that others overlook completely because their attention is directed outward instead of inward awareness. What often confuses others is that this level of perception does not make the empath judgmental in a harsh way. Instead, it makes them understanding in a way that feels almost contradictory. They can see the darker parts of people clearly. They recognize where behavior comes from, whether it is pain, insecurity, fear, or past wounds. They understand the root of manipulation instead of just reacting to the surface of it. And still, instead of using that understanding to harm or expose others, they often choose restraint. That choice is not softness, it is discipline and emotional control developed through experience, because it is very easy to become cold after being hurt. It is easy to shut people out completely. It is easy to respond to harm with harm and label it as strength. But real control is not reacting in the same way others do. Real control is seeing exactly what someone is doing, understanding their intention fully, and still choosing not to become a reflection of their behavior. That is a level of awareness that most people do not even consider because they are too focused on immediate reaction rather than long-term understanding of consequences. People around empaths often assume they are unaware of what is happening. They assume kindness means ignorance, patience means blindness, and silence means not noticing. That assumption gives them confidence to push limits and test boundaries. It creates the belief that they are getting away with something or that their behavior is going unnoticed. But the truth is completely different. The empath is not unaware. They are observing everything without needing to respond immediately. Silence does not mean absence of understanding. Calmness does not mean lack of perception. It often means control over reaction while collecting information. They allow people to reveal themselves naturally, not because they cannot see it earlier, but because they prefer truth over assumptions. Every inconsistency in words, every contradiction in behavior, every moment where energy does not match intention is stored mentally, not for revenge, not for drama, but for clarity. They build understanding slowly instead of rushing to conclusions. They let patterns repeat until they are undeniable. And even then, they often remain composed, giving space for truth to fully show itself without interference. This kind of patience is rare because most people struggle to hold awareness without reacting instantly. Many respond too quickly, judge too early, or escalate situations unnecessarily. But empaths tend to absorb first. They process internally before expressing externally. They analyze emotional patterns before making decisions. That delay is not hesitation, it is precision. It is the difference between reacting emotionally and responding with understanding. And this ability creates something others do not expect. It creates a quiet kind of strength, not loud, not attention seeking, but steady and deeply grounded. People who are loud often reveal themselves too quickly. Their reactions expose their thoughts immediately. But those who move with awareness and silence are harder to read. They do not need to prove what they see or what they know. They simply understand, adjust, and move accordingly without announcing their awareness to the world. They don't need validation anymore. They don't need to constantly prove that they are right in every situation. They already understand what they need to understand. And knowing without reacting is a form of power most people underestimate because reaction gives away information. Reaction exposes emotional triggers. Reaction reveals boundaries, limits, and pressure points. But when someone stays composed, when they remain steady and aware without revealing what they feel inside, they become difficult to read. They stop being predictable. They stop being easy to influence. And in that state, they are no longer operating on the same surface level as everyone else. People who rely on manipulation depend heavily on emotional reactions. They need responses to feel in control. They need visible frustration, confusion, or attachment to continue their pattern. But when they are faced with someone who does not respond in the expected way, their strategy begins to lose effectiveness. That is where discomfort starts to build, because they can no longer identify weaknesses easily. They cannot predict behavior based on emotional impulses. Instead, they are faced with silence, awareness, and calm observation that does not give them anything to work with. This is where a major misunderstanding about kindness begins to fall apart. Many people assume that kindness means agreement, that patience means permission, and that silence means surrender. But in reality, none of those assumptions are accurate. Kindness can exist alongside awareness. Patience can exist alongside boundaries. Silence can exist alongside observation. What looks like softness from the outside can actually be a deliberate form of control where every reaction is measured instead of impulsive. Real strength is not about responding immediately. It is about knowing when response is necessary and when it is not. When someone reaches this level of self-control, they stop reacting to every provocation. They stop engaging in every emotional situation that tries to pull them in. They stop investing energy into people and moments that do not contribute to their growth or peace. Instead of reacting automatically, they begin to choose intentionally. And that shift from reaction to choice completely changes how they move through life. Choice creates distance from manipulation. Choice removes emotional control from others. Choice returns power back to the individual. The moment this awareness settles in, freedom begins to develop. freedom from expectations that were never aligned with reality, freedom from emotional pressure created by others, freedom from the need to constantly respond or explain oneself. And in that freedom, something subtle changes in how others perceive them. People who once expected predictable reactions start noticing unpredictability. People who relied on emotional responses start noticing withdrawal. Attention becomes selective instead of automatic, and that change creates confusion in those who were used to access without resistance. That confusion is not accidental. It comes from a broken assumption. Many people build their behavior around the belief that others will react in familiar ways. When that expectation is removed, their strategies lose structure. They begin to realize that their influence is not as strong as they assumed, and at the same time, the person they are dealing with becomes more grounded, more aware of patterns, and more conscious of intention behind behavior rather than just behavior itself. At this stage, awareness does not decrease, it deepens. Once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. Once patterns are recognized, they cannot be ignored. Once intentions become visible through repeated behavior, illusions lose their effect. This is not emotional detachment in the cold sense people often assume. It is clarity. It is the ability to separate emotion from observation, reaction from understanding, and impulse from judgment. And that clarity changes everything about how relationships and interactions are processed. Pain plays a major role in this transformation, even though it is rarely understood in the moment it is experienced. Pain does not arrive randomly or without effect. It exposes patterns that were previously invisible. It forces attention onto behavior that was once ignored. It removes illusions that made certain situations seem safe or stable. At first, it feels like loss. It feels like trust is being broken, like emotional safety is disappearing, like something essential is being taken away. And in a sense, something is being taken away, but it is not the whole picture. While pain removes certain illusions, it also builds something new in their place. It creates sharper perception. It increases sensitivity to inconsistency. It strengthens the ability to detect when words and actions do not align. Over time, this creates a different kind of intelligence, one that is not based on assumption, but on observation. Instead of accepting statements at face value, behavior becomes the real language being read. Instead of trusting promises alone, consistency becomes the measure of truth. This shift does not make a person colder in an emotional sense, but it does make them more selective. They stop attaching to potential without evidence. They stop investing in people who have not shown stability. They stop giving full emotional access to those who have not demonstrated reliability. And this selectiveness is often misunderstood by others as distance or detachment, when in reality it is simply a more accurate way of engaging with reality. As this awareness grows, personal standards begin to rise naturally. Tolerance for inconsistency decreases. The circle of trust becomes smaller, but more stable. Time is no longer spent explaining oneself to those who are committed to misunderstanding. Energy is no longer invested in people who benefit more from absence than presence. Emotional effort is no longer given freely without alignment. And this is not bitterness, it is refinement. It is a restructuring of how value is exchanged emotionally and mentally. From the outside, it may look like change, but internally it is alignment. Alignment with truth instead of illusion. Alignment with awareness instead of assumption. Alignment with self-respect instead of emotional dependency. Pain forces this alignment through experience. It pushes a person beyond comfort until staying the same becomes more painful than evolving. And in that pressure, transformation begins naturally, not as a choice made in ease, but as a necessity created by experience. Through this process, emotional depth does not disappear. It becomes more structured. Feeling remains, but it is no longer uncontrolled. Awareness begins to guide emotion instead of emotion controlling awareness. And that balance is what creates real stability. Because feeling deeply without boundaries leads to exhaustion and vulnerability, but feeling deeply with awareness creates strength and clarity at the same time. What is lost in this process is the version of a person that tolerated too much, ignored too many signs, and gave without awareness of limits. What is gained is a version that understands value, recognizes patterns quickly, and responds with intention instead of impulse. And that transformation is not visible immediately to others, but it is deeply felt internally. It changes how situations are interpreted, how people are evaluated, and how energy is distributed in every interaction moving forward. You went through it, and because you went through it, your entire relationship with it changed over time. What once felt overwhelming or confusing slowly became something you started to understand instead of fear. And that shift matters more than people realize. Because fear thrives in uncertainty, but understanding removes that uncertainty. Once you understand something clearly, it stops having the same control over you. It no longer pulls you in the same way it used to. It no longer confuses you or overwhelms you in the same manner, because now you can see it for what it actually is instead of what it felt like in the moment. That is why experiences that once felt painful do not affect you in the same way anymore. It is not that you stopped feeling, and it is not that your emotions disappeared. It is that your awareness expanded. You begin to notice what is behind behavior instead of just reacting to behavior itself. You start seeing what motivates people, what patterns they repeat, what intentions exist beneath their actions. And when you can see clearly like that, it naturally protects you. It prevents you from falling into the same cycles again, because now you recognize them before they fully develop. You no longer give the same energy to the same type of situations or people, because you can identify them earlier. That is what real transformation looks like. It is not about becoming someone completely different. It is about becoming more aligned with who you are, without confusion, without illusions, and without unnecessary emotional attachments that once clouded your judgment. Over time, that shift becomes permanent. You do not return to the version of yourself that was unaware. You do not unsee what you have already understood. You do not go back to giving freely without awareness of cost, because now you recognize the cost clearly. And once something is understood at that level, it changes how everything else is approached. One of the most misunderstood forms of power is not loud or aggressive or attention seeking. It is distance. Not distance created out of anger or resentment, but distance created out of clarity. Because when you finally begin to understand people on a deeper level, something within you changes. You stop reacting in ways they expect. You stop engaging in patterns they are used to. You stop feeding dynamics that once gave them influence over your emotions. And in that space, silence becomes more powerful than confrontation ever was. People are often prepared for arguments. They expect confrontation. They prepare responses, justifications, explanations, and defenses. But what they are not prepared for is absence. They are not prepared for someone who simply steps back without explanation. No emotional reaction, no dramatic closure, no argument to respond to, just quiet distance that removes access entirely. And that kind of absence is more unsettling than any verbal exchange because it cannot be debated or manipulated. It simply creates space where their behavior is left without your participation. When you detach, you are not just walking away emotionally, you are removing the very thing that gave certain patterns life in the first place. You are removing attention, energy, and emotional reaction. Without those elements, influence weakens naturally. This is why emotional detachment is often misunderstood. It is not coldness, it is control. It is not shutting off emotion. It is deciding where emotion is allowed to be invested. It is understanding that not every situation deserves your response, not every person deserves your engagement, and not every action deserves your reaction. Once you begin operating from that mindset, everything becomes more intentional. You stop reacting automatically. You stop responding out of habit. You stop getting pulled into situations that only exist to drain your attention. Instead, you begin to choose carefully. And choice changes everything because it restores control back to you. Most people do not realize how often they give away that control simply through reaction. Every emotional reaction reveals something, whether it is a trigger, a boundary, or a vulnerability. And once those are visible, they can be influenced. But when you control your reactions, you also control what others can read about you. That is where detachment becomes strategic rather than emotional. It is not about avoiding people because of pain. It is about stepping back because of awareness. Awareness of patterns that do not support your peace. Awareness of behaviors that do not align with your standards. Awareness of people who only engage when it benefits them. And once that awareness is present, distance becomes natural, not forced, not dramatic, but necessary. This is also where misunderstandings begin to form. People around you may assume you have changed in a negative sense. They may think you have become distant, colder, or less emotional. But what actually changes is not your ability to feel. It is your willingness to give access without reason. You become more selective about where your energy goes. You stop explaining yourself to those who were never trying to understand. You stop proving your value to those who are already committed to undervaluing it. And that shift cannot be easily interpreted by those who benefited from your previous openness. Absence carries a different kind of impact than words ever could. Words can be challenged, misunderstood, or ignored. But absence creates reflection. When someone no longer has access to your presence or your reactions, they are left with their own actions without distraction. They are left to face the space where your responses used to be. And that silence often becomes louder than any conversation because it forces people to confront what they previously ignored or took for granted. For those who were used to your availability, your attention, or your emotional engagement, that absence becomes noticeable quickly. Not because you announced it, but because it changed the structure of interaction itself. And in that change, power shifts. Not the kind of power that is shown through confrontation, but the kind that exists through restraint. The power of choosing not to engage. The power of remaining unaffected. The power of refusing to participate in dynamics that no longer serve you. Disengagement at this level becomes a boundary that does not need explanation. It does not require approval or understanding from others. It simply exists as a decision made through self-respect. And self-respect does not chase, does not argue, and does not convince. It observes, it evaluates, and it removes itself from what does not align. That is why emotional detachment is not emptiness. It is discipline. It is the ability to still feel, still understand, still perceive, but not allow those emotions to be misused or misdirected. At this point, emotional depth does not disappear. It becomes protected. You still see things clearly. You still understand people deeply. You still feel situations more intensely than many others might. But you no longer give that depth freely to those who cannot hold it responsibly. That protection is not aggression, it is structure. It is the creation of boundaries that preserve what is valuable instead of exposing it without awareness. And once that structure is in place, everything shifts. You move differently through situations. You think before reacting instead of reacting before thinking. You evaluate instead of assuming. You observe instead of absorbing everything blindly. And through that process, your emotional world becomes more stable. Not because it is smaller, but because it is more controlled. In the end, what remains is not someone who is disconnected from emotion, but someone who understands emotion deeply enough to no longer misuse it. A presence that is calm, aware, and intentional. A presence that does not need to prove itself because it already understands exactly what it is and exactly what it refuses to become.